Hey, weirdos, I'm Ash.
And I'm Elena.
And this is Morbid.
This is a special Morbid.
Shut up, I was going to say that. I was literally going to say this is a special edition of Morbid because we've got a guest today. We have director Christopher Cassel on. He's going to be talking to us about his new documentary on Peacock. It's called Pathological, The Lies of Joran Sloot. It is such a great documentary. Like, if you like true crime documentaries, you're going to enjoy this.
Yeah, it's wild. It gives you some very interesting points of views. And we just covered the Natalie Holloway case on Morbid. I believe it's the last episode.
Yeah, it should be the last episode
right
that we
before
did.
this. So after listening to that, this is kind of a perfect little companion because you get to hear a little more behind the scenes.
Yeah, going deeper.
Our guy Chris there, he talked to a lot of like the major players in this case. He talked to people outside of it. It's interesting. He has a unique point of view on the whole thing. I think.
He does, definitely.
Yeah, and he was really, really open with like giving us a ton of information and stuff. It was a really fun conversation.
Yeah, it was definitely a lot of fun. So
Yeah.
Here you go.
Enjoy.
All right. So hello, Chris. How are you?
I'm doing really well. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Thank you for coming on. We're talking about Pathological, The Lies of Joran Sloot today. It premiered on Peacock, and it was a really entertaining documentary. It was awesome.
Thank you.
And I think one of the first questions I wanted to ask you is, I actually noticed that this is one of the first true crime documentaries that you've done. Is that right?
It's, I would say, the third. So, yeah, I did 2 series for ID that I directed.
Okay.
Nothing super recent. One was in 2019 called Primal Instinct, and then the other was way back in 2011 called Red Rum.
Okay.
So,
nice.
yeah.
So what drew you into the Natalie Holloway case specifically? And what would you say the main goal of making this specific documentary was?
Well, I remember, as does everybody, who's, I guess, any older than 20, everybody remembers this Natalie Holloway case. It was always sort of fascinating and tragic. And, I sort of just kept tabs on it over the years. The timing of this seemed, it seemed appropriate because this is really most likely the end of the line for the story of Joran. I don't think there'll be another chapter, at least related to Natalie. You never know.
Right.
But it seemed like the right time to look back and do a pretty exhaustive and comprehensive look at, all sides of the case, but not only the Natalie case, but the case in Peru with Stephanie Flores, and then the strange and disturbing connection between the two, which really leads into that extortion trial that he faced in the States last year.
Right.
Which, just kind of connects the two cases in this weird and surprising way. So, yeah, I mean, it just felt like the right time. It's a fascinating character. This, if you can call him a character, Joran, it's just such I guess, a textbook psychopath, really.
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah, but just somebody who, it's just fascinating that somebody can be that cold, and I kind of wanted to try to get beneath the surface of that as much as I could.
I feel like the documentary did a good job of pointing out the fact that he definitely is a psychopath and all the reasons why he is and the characteristics behind that.
Yeah.
And it gave a lot more too, because we were talking about this because we just covered the case on the show, the Natalie Holloway case at least. And we were talking about how when it was going on in real time, it became such like a convoluted kind of coverage of the case that you weren't really getting coverage of the case anymore. You were getting like these wild, like back and forths and these weird interviews that he was doing. And like, I remember watching it being like, but what's happening? Like, what's going on? Who is this guy?
So
Like,
many
what?
interviews.
And it's like nobody knew what was going on. We just knew like the kind of like sensationalistic way that it was being shown. And I feel like the documentary really like honed in on what we all wanted to know, what was going on and who he is and why, like how all this happened.
Yeah. And I never realized until I did the film how many different versions of the Natalie story he told. I think in
It's
the end, we
wild.
counted about 12 that were very
I was trying
distinct.
to count them as I was going through.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's unhinged.
And it almost seems like it was part of a strategy. And I don't know if it was initially a conscious strategy on his part or not, but just to further muddy the waters by just telling all these different stories. And with this confidence that he had that the body wouldn't be found, and so
Exactly.
he figured, there's nothing that really going to do to him without the body. So he's just going to, he almost seemed like he was having fun with it all.
Yeah, it seemed like he was trying to prove something. Like he was kind of trying to prove, like, I can change this story 100 times and nothing's going to happen to me.
Yeah.
And you're all just going to have to listen to it. I'm going to send people on wild goose chases and I can do it because I'm Joran.
And it
no
really
one's going
did.
to find it.
The scary part is how long it worked for him doing that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's crazy.
It's sick.
And, you can just see almost this sort of like devilish glee that he takes as he's in these interviews and sort of telling all these different, tall tales.
Absolutely.
And then as we go into, he figures out how to profit off of them, and that sort of becomes the way he makes his living.
Exactly.
So gross.
So it's just sick.
The way he smirks through them really like turns your
Oh,
stomach.
it does.
Yeah.
But like we just touched on, I mean, the details of the Natalie Holloway case are so well known, especially given the way that it captivated the nation and the way it was like parlayed in the media. But in your documentary, I thought it was a really great balance of information with Natalie's story and with Stephanie's story, which I do feel like sometimes gets lost in the retelling of these cases.
Yeah.
Did you know from the start going into this that you wanted to tell the story side by side, kind of going through the timeline with both girls like you did?
I don't know at the very beginning if I knew that, but I figured it out pretty quickly when I looked at the symmetry of the dates, and they were 5 years apart, like to the day, which is just wild.
To the day.
And a lot of those, like, so there's the day they both disappeared, and then the several days after that in both years, 2005 and 2010, that have these striking parallels. And it just seemed like that would be a good way to interweave them, and then to see the similarities, in his kind of actions and just in these scenarios that happen so far apart. So the other thing is, I didn't want to only tell the Natalie story up front and go chronologically, because I feel like the Peru story is the one that people are less familiar with. And I wanted to inject pieces of that early on so that, we could keep people who felt like they already knew everything about Natalie.
Right.
And so it made sense to interweave them.
Definitely. Is that why you made the decision to start with Joran's ex, Eva, to kind of bring in new people who maybe didn't know that part of the story?
Yeah. I mean, that was the other really cool kind of coup for us, really. I mean, her story is crazy. She's like officially on the run from the law. She was really hard to find. She's like, by design, she doesn't want to be found. And she's somebody nobody had ever heard from. This was the first interview she'd ever done. And so we wanted to showcase that right up front and, let people know that you're going to learn something new here. Even if you followed every single piece of the case for 18 years, you're going to find out some new things.
Definitely. And I think Eva's a good representation of how he just victimizes women like constantly.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I learned watching the documentary was that he actually has quite a history of being violent or predatory with women. And you did touch on that in the documentary. Can you kind of expand on that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we can kind of only go by the reports of people who, well, two of our best sources were the authors of a book called Portrait of a Monster, who did a lot of research, spent a lot of time in Aruba talking to people off the record, on the record. Joran's inner circle there, his family is very tough to crack. So it took some detective work to put together the pieces of his childhood. But what we were able to find was that, he had this violent streak and this sort of angry streak from a pretty early age. And, by the time Natalie came along, he was 17. But he had this whole MO down. He already had a lot of experience getting into the casinos because he looked older. He had figured out how to kind of woo these tourists that would come in. And so many teenage American tourists were coming down, particularly back then. It's changed actually since it's Natalie. But so he had a whole kind of approach that, he'd used on girls before Natalie and also on local girls.
Mm-hmm.
So there were several that had filed complaints against him prior to Natalie's disappearance that hadn't quite been investigated yet. And then in the shadow of all this media that erupted on the island after Natalie disappeared, they all kind of shrunk away and just decided they didn't want to talk. And so it seems that there was already a well-established pattern of sexual abuse and violence in his history, even before the point that, Natalie disappeared.
It is crazy how all that kind of got overshadowed or covered up. And I think part of that has to do with, like you said, their family history is very hard to uncover.
Yeah.
And kind of going into that, I think the relationship with Van der Straten, the lead investigator, he had close ties with Joran's dad. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and what that kind of looks like?
Sure. They were both from the Netherlands. Aruba is a province or it's under the Netherlands control or umbrella. And so there are a lot of Dutch who come over and work in the government, work, in kind of the legal trade in Aruba. And both Van der Straten and Paulus van der Sloot were among those. They had come over. They had been friends in the Netherlands. They came over, I think, when Joran was 4, or Paulus did. I don't know when Van der Straten got there. But they apparently were so close that Van der Straten was Joran's godfather.
Mm-hmm.
So clearly they're, kind of an inside connection between the family and law enforcement. And quite likely, if not a spoken effort, an unspoken effort between the two men to, try to sweep this under the rug.
Definitely. And do you think, because obviously, and we see it in your film, when Paulus dies, that's when Joran really starts to kind of spiral out of control.
Yeah.
Do you feel like that was a pivotal shift in how everything played out in the rest of this case, these two cases?
Yeah, I think it definitely was. So, I mean, not to say that Joran went from a, saint to a sinner at this point. He was already, he was already kind of well established as, being kind of a bad guy. But after his father dies, it's interesting. We talk about at the funeral in the Netherlands, Joran throws himself on the casket. He makes a big show of saying, this is all my fault, thinking that the stress of the case, which is quite probably right, that the stress of the case is what caused Paulus's heart attack. And so whether Joran really deeply feels this remorse and this personal responsibility or not is impossible to say. But, certainly he made a big show of it. And so he then goes back to Aruba to, ostensibly take care of his mother, help his mother through this hard time. But no sooner is he back there than he starts emailing Beth Holloway's lawyer. Beth is Natalie's mother. And with this proposal to basically try to profit off of his knowledge of where Natalie is and profit off of Beth's vulnerability and her desire for answers. And so that's such a dark, even for somebody like him to then decide not only to end someone's life and not admit it, but then go back to the mother of that person and shake her down for money in exchange for answers is just kind of a new level of diabolical. And so this starts to happen right after his father's death. And then within 2 weeks of, him kind of striking this deal, which we can go into deeper detail if you like about.
Definitely.
He flies off to Peru and then goes on to murder another girl. So yeah, it seems like, you could definitely point to this, to the death of his father as being a really significant turning point for him.
100%. And I felt so bad for Beth's lawyer. One of the parts in the documentary is that he feels like he has blood on his hands because of this whole extortion thing, that it did somewhat fund his trip to Peru, but how was he to know that was going to happen,
Yeah. And, he really expected that once the FBI, because the FBI was involved in this, and so was the Aruban police or investigators. And he thought by the time he left the island, he being John Kelly, Beth's lawyer, that Joran would have been arrested and picked up for basically fabricating this whole story that he told John when he was there, which they captured on audio tape and videotape. And so he had no expectation that Joran was going to have time to spend this money. He thought, it was like a one-way ticket to jail, and then, and that would be it. But they didn't pick him up, and we're not. And we talk about this, like, we don't know why. We don't know why the FBI didn't pick him up at that point, or the Aruban authorities, and he was able to skip town.
There's so many points in the story where you're like, how is he continuing to get away with these things? And especially with the FBI's involvement, it's really mind-boggling that he was able to continue just to go on and do what he did.
And it was like that watching it unfold too in real time. Because I remember there's so many times during this case where we were all like, this is it.
This
like
has
they're
gotta
going to
be
find
it.
Natalie. They're finally going to arrest this guy.
Yeah.
Like everyone knew.
Yeah.
We were all just waiting for it. And I just remember all the time thinking like, why aren't they arresting? Like, what is going on? Like, why is this taking so long? It's wild.
It is wild. But the weird thing is, too, they did arrest him in Aruba, and they held him for, I think, 90 days, and they interrogated him, and they flew in these special Dutch investigators to like run these brutal interrogations, and he just never gave them anything. So that led some people to think, well, maybe he is innocent because he hasn't fessed up, and he's only 17. Like, how could he not crack under pressure?
He's a hard 17.
Yeah,
He was.
Yeah, no kidding. But, if you have, as we talk about in the film, some of these characteristics of psychopathy, a lack of remorse or a real feeling of any kind, it's probably a lot easier to kind of resist some of those typical interrogation tactics.
For sure.
Yeah.
Definitely. He really is, like you said, a tough 17 and like a character.
Yeah.
Going into making this film, I did read that you did try to reach out to get some kind of comment from him, right?
Yes, I sent him through his public defender in Alabama. I sent a letter and I never got a response, but I think they had a pretty strict embargo on him talking to anybody while he was in the States.
Definitely. How do you think that would have changed the film? Do you think it would have changed the film in any way?
It certainly would have. Yeah. I mean, I would have been compelled to kind of make his point of view, a primary part of the story. And I'm almost, you always kind of want to hear from the protagonist, but, in a way, I'm almost glad that we didn't get him. I think I am glad because he would just spin so many lies that, we wouldn't get any closer to the truth. We'd probably be further from it. And I think it was actually better that we were able to look at him from different points of view, from, more objective, and kind of more sane points of view.
Yeah.
And not be clouded by all the lies that he would tell. And, he's also, as psychopaths usually are, very good at eliciting sympathy and empathy. And, he certainly would have tried that with us, I'm sure. And may have left more of the audience feeling sympathetic for him than I think he would deserve. So.
Oh, I think that would be awful.
I completely agree.
I agree. I wondered how you felt about that, but I definitely agree with you that I think it makes it better that he didn't have a voice in it necessarily.
Yeah. He's had enough of a voice.
Yeah,
he sure has.
And, we do include a lot of interview clips with him over the years, but really in the context of showing that, this was all a game for him and, that it was a game of profit. It was just, just one lie after another. And you can kind of see that pretty clearly when you intercut all these different interviews he did.
Definitely.
Over the years.
Was there anything that you learned along the way that came as a shock to you, or anything you didn't know previously about the case and making the film that you learned?
Yeah. I mean, the biggest thing for me was just this connection between the two cases and the fact that had Beth Holloway not paid him $25,000 in exchange for, well, we should go deeper into exactly why she did that. But, essentially she paid him $25,000 for answers about what happened to Natalie. And he ended up using that money pretty much directly to go to Peru and kill this other, and ends up killing this other girl. And so you do have to ask, like, would that have happened had the extortion scheme not happened? And, as her lawyer said, he feels he has blood on his hands. And Beth, of course, felt awful about it. But, the fact that there was this direct connection was, shocking and just so preventable, you would think, in hindsight,
Absolutely.
So, yeah, that for me was the biggest, like, kind of wow moment.
Yeah, that was the biggest thing for me watching it, just seeing, like you said in the beginning, how their stories just parallel so much with each other, and even how the family's experiences parallel with each other, like Beth showing up to the island, wanting answers immediately, Stephanie's father going out right away, looking for her car, finding it in the seedy area. Like, the parallels are awful, and the family's experiences are so intertwined. Yeah,
absolutely. Another interesting thing was the different perspectives on the case and the huge difference in willingness to participate that we found between Peru and Aruba.
I wondered about that.
Yeah. In Peru, every door was opened, because I think, just on its face, it's a totally different story in Peru. They got their man, they convicted him, they put him in jail. The body was found, it was open and shut. There's nothing really to hide or regret. So, everyone who was involved in the case, from the lead interrogator to the drivers who drove the getaway car unknowingly to his girlfriend, agreed to participate. In Aruba, it was a very different story. A lot of the people we spoke with that had the closest connection to the case, that are still there, literally told us off the record, like, I'll get death threats if I talk to you. Like,
wow.
People here do not want this in the media anymore. They threaten people who speak about it. And so there's, a very concerted effort in Aruba to just make this go away still 18 years later.
Definitely.
And so nobody wants to talk, so that kind of complicated it a little bit. But thankfully there's been so much news coverage of this over the years in Aruba, and such a deep archive to draw from that wasn't really a huge issue.
Definitely.
But it would have been nice to get a few more perspectives, current perspectives in Aruba.
Who in particular would you have wanted to speak to in Aruba?
There were a couple of lawyers who were really close to the case, but more than anything, I would have liked to talk to Joran's mother, Anita.
I could see that. I could definitely see that.
She's done a handful of interviews. Nothing really that I've seen since, I believe, 2010, when Stephanie disappeared. I think that she did one interview after that, and then she just decided she couldn't anymore. So it's been a long time since she's spoken publicly, but that would have given us a lot of insight into Joran's history and his early years and stuff.
Absolutely.
But at the same time, it's, fully understandable why she doesn't want to talk. And you have to feel for her as a mother,
oh, yeah.
So, but we tried.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a complicated relationship there, because it sounds like in the beginning, obviously, nobody wants to believe that their son is capable of that. But then to find out that he did get convicted of Stephanie's murder, and it's very cut and dry that he did it. So she has to accept that, and that must be awful.
And you can see it, her kind of evolving impression of the case and of Joran in her interviews, where in the early ones in 2005, she's defending him tooth and nail and saying, he's an honest boy, she says. He's very loving. Why would anybody, who has all basically the blessings that he has, want to do something like this? It just doesn't make any sense. And then after Stephanie's death in 2010, she's definitely, you can tell she's just rethinking everything about him, and she still loves him, obviously, but you can tell she's angry and sad and frustrated. And so it's, his actions affected so many people beyond the two principal victims, his own family, obviously Natalie and Stephanie's families, but the whole island of Aruba, and the economy there, it had really far-reaching consequences for so many people.
Absolutely. I think there's so many different victims in this, and especially Joran's mom. One of the things you touched on in the film is that she was actually trying to get him help right before he left for Peru, and that sentiment is just haunting. The fact that she really wanted him to get some kind of help, to talk to a psychiatrist, to even, it sounded like some kind of like inpatient thing even, and then he just disappeared.
Yeah. She was going to send him back to the Netherlands for an inpatient, treatment. So, and I know he had seen psychologists through the years. We don't have great details on those, but we know that before Natalie disappeared, he had been seeing one. So it was no secret in the family that he needed help, but you have to be receptive to the help and, acknowledge that you need it in order for it to work. So,
and as a mother, your first thing is always going to be like, no, of course, not my child. Sure, they may need a little bit of extra help, but no way could they have done this awful thing that I can't even fathom. But I imagine when the murder of Stephanie happened, I'm sure it was like, I don't think he's being caught up in these two things accidentally. Like, that realization was probably really hard to hit, that second one, because it's like, I don't think it's a coincidence that my son is just being placed in these two awful cases with nothing connected to it. So, that was probably the thing that was like, that you have to kind of face it at that point.
Yeah.
That must have been so hard.
Even after he killed Stephanie, he called home to his mother, and his mother had heard that they were looking for him in Peru. And she said, you should turn yourself in. And he gave her a whole story about how he actually was like, what do you mean? She's dead?
Oh my God.
And he said, well, when I left, she was alive, but there were these two shady cops that were,
of course,
blah, blah, blah. It's just, it just never ends.
Yeah. It's always interesting. He tries to pin it on two other men always.
And there are always stories that sound like they're from like some crime novels movie. Or something. Like, I'm like, you're just making things up. Like, it's not even probable.
It's really not.
Sad story, all around.
Truly.
Absolutely. With that being said, what do you think about the latest confession?
Well, I feel sort of like, as people will see, John Kelly and Matt Holloway, Natalie's brother, feel, which is that it's not the whole truth.
That's how I feel. I agree.
Yeah. I mean, the fundamental truth that he killed her is there, and he's never said that outright before. But I think that's where the truth ends. So the details of it include that he, it's just so graphic to even think about, but that he bashed her head in with a cinder block that he had found laying on the beach. So how come a bloody cinder block was never found?
Mm-hmm.
That would be a pretty easy thing that'd be a hard thing to dispose of and an easy thing to find.
Yeah.
And then the idea that he just waded into the water with her and just kind of pushed her off from, he went in waist deep and just pushed her off. So everybody I've spoken with since this came out in Aruba, because I have had a lot of conversations off the record. They're just like, there's with the currents there, that's just not how it would work. He would just wash right back in.
Right.
So that's just BS. So then you have to wonder. So in that way, the story isn't fully over, because we still don't, still don't know what happened aside from the fact that he killed her. So the mystery continues on some level.
It does. I do wonder if there's some truth in each part of the different stories that he's told. Because at one point, somebody came with a boat and they put her on the boat and then they dropped her off of the boat. Even saying that is so awful. But I have to wonder if there's little truths in each variation.
Yes. And one of the people we interviewed, Michelle Kosinski, who was an NBC reporter who covered this story for years, said, I don't know if it was on camera or off, but she said to me, the one common denominator that you find in almost all of his stories is some sort of blunt force head trauma.
Yeah.
So from the very first story, when he said he dropped her off at the Holiday Inn after they'd been out and she fell out of the car and hit her head on the ground. There was one story once that he told about, he brought her to a friend's house and she was doing cocaine on the balcony and she fell off the balcony and, fell on her head and died. So there's just been all these iterations of her having some sort of head trauma. And the cinder block just being the latest of those. So, it's certainly more likely than not that was an element in her death.
Because it's almost like he's prepared. Like, I think most of him believes she'll never be found. And he believes he's taken care of it. He's so confident in himself.
Yeah.
Classic. But I think like part of him is also covering for when she is found. Like he's keeping that element the same kind of thing. So if, so whenever she was found, it would have that element in it, especially if it's like she fell. It was an accident. She banged her head. If she's found and she banged her head, he told you it was an accident. And at least this one, he's saying he did it, but it feels like before it might have been like covering for if she was found, that I already said it was an accident. I told you she hit her head. Like,
I haven't thought about it like that, but that's probably true.
I think
so. Now, like, where is she? Because were you a little worried that she would be found? And it's like, and if you were a little worried she would be found and possibly found
with head
well
trauma
enough that we could tell she had head trauma, where is she? Because I don't think she's in the ocean, if that's the case.
It makes you think. When you start to reflect on all the different stories he has told, your mind just starts to spin.
Because you got to believe there's something within each one.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the key common denominator there. Then there's the dad who creeps into a couple of the stories and who so many people still believe was complicit in the death and in the cover-up. So, that's a whole thing in itself.
So that's an interesting part.
What are your thoughts on that, if you want to share?
Yeah, I mean, well, it's interesting. He never implicates his father until right after his father's death. And suddenly he's saying, my dad disposed of the body. So, which is cold to begin with. Like,
yeah.
Particularly if it's not true. It's like your dad just died and now you're
pinning it on him.
Smearing his name.
Yeah.
Crazy. But I don't know. I mean, I certainly can see a scenario where he was involved, but I can't go so far as to say he definitely was. And, if he wasn't, then, I feel awful for his family. But, the other thing that's interesting is that this happened when Joran's mother was back in the Netherlands, that she wasn't home. And so
I didn't realize that.
Yeah. And so his dad was the only parent around, and his dad
interesting.
Literally would take him to casinos and drink with him and gamble. And so I don't think he was like, he certainly wasn't the
typical relationship.
He was a friend, not a parent at that point, sort of, at least.
And so certainly it's possible, as the film shows, Natalie's brother is pretty confident that he was involved. We spoke to a lawyer on the island. We did interview one who was involved in the case. And, she said without saying that he was involved.
She definitely seemed very confident in that. And that made me start to think even more.
Yeah. And you do have to wonder, somebody else made the point that Natalie was never found. Whereas when he killed Stephanie and he didn't have his father and he didn't have any help with him, he just left her in the room,
everything.
A complete mess. There was no forethought of like, how can I cover this up? There was no attempt to cover it up.
He just ran.
That's the part that gets me.
Yeah. Whereas with Natalie, we still don't know what happened to her. And you do have to wonder, was there someone a little smarter, a little more grown up that, stepped in and helped him cover this up? Because Stephanie's, the Stephanie incident certainly demonstrates that he doesn't really have that capacity himself.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, as much as the two cases parallel, there are really marked differences in the fact that he just leaves her and then goes on the run. Yeah. And then also with the way he confesses. When he's caught, he does tell a weird story where he was set up and yada yada, but you played the clip in your film of him confessing, and he's so matter-of-fact, so nonchalant about it. Mm-hmm. What do you think that was, where we got so many stories with Natalie, but with Stephanie, it was just, he finally caved and said, yes, I did this. And it didn't take however many years.
Yeah, well, I think a couple of things. He didn't crack until they promised him they would send him back to Aruba. And they basically lied to him to get him to stop lying. So he thought, like, if I tell them, then they'll let me go back to Aruba, which is just silly that he could even think that would happen. But at any rate, there's that. And then there's the fact that they had her body. They had his shirt that was all bloody that he had left in the room. Just so much evidence that he killed her that they confronted him with. And, what are you going to do at that point?
Yeah.
Yeah, you kind of have to own up.
Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, I wonder if by that point he just felt like he would figure out a way out, even if he told them, point blank, I did it, that he'd find a way.
Right.
And this time he wasn't able to.
And it's crazy that like some of the worst, most diabolical killers fall for like the stupidest things. Like it reminds me of like BTK right. with like, if I send you this floppy disk, can you trace it? And they were like, no, not way. At all. Don't worry about it. And he was like, cool. And immediately that's what catches him. It's the same thing. It's like, you'll send me back to Aruba if I said I did this? And they're like, totally. And he's like, all right, here you go. Like, that's all it takes.
It's
like,
true.
Right.
It's crazy.
Right.
Well, and you want to find some solace in the fact that he is in prison, that, I mean, the sentence is, what, 28 years? Is that right?
I think it was 28, but it was then brought up to 35 because he was convicted of dealing cocaine in the prison.
Right, which you explore that in the film. That's a whole story in and of itself.
Yeah.
But so you want to find that solace that he is in prison, but you do kind of touch on the film that the Peruvian prison system is a little bit different than what we would expect here in America. They get to have visitors. He got married. He had a child while in prison. He ended up with another girlfriend. Can you tell us a little bit about all that?
Yeah, we actually filmed at the first prison he was in, and it's not a place that you'd want to go like on your honeymoon by any means, but
No.
it's certainly different. I mean, there's a lot of rough characters there, but they do have kind of a lot of freedom to roam about during the day. There were a lot of people there meeting with family and lawyers and stuff, and people bringing them things, and they're just sitting at like open air tables, almost like you're in a really crappy Starbucks.
Oh man.
And yeah, they're allowed, most prisoners are allowed conjugal visits. They're allowed a lot of visitors. And I guess the philosophy is like, just keep them calm, keep them as content as possible so they don't riot.
Yeah.
So yeah. And then when he came to Alabama to face the charges last year, I started to hear that he couldn't wait to get back to Peru. And
I believe it.
It's hard to imagine a Peruvian prison being more inviting than a prison in the United States, but that seems to have been the case. And it's funny, we had a sound guy that worked with us when we did some interviews in Alabama, who said I think it was his wife's brother or cousin was actually in the same cell block as Joran and would heckle him all night long, every night to keep him awake.
That's amazing.
That's incredible.
So I hope that guy gets paroled early, but
I was going to say, he's doing a good job there.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, he obviously was hated by all the prisoners there because he's on Natalie's home turf. And so he did not enjoy his time in Alabama by any means.
Oh, it's a bummer he couldn't stay there.
I know.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people feel that way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that was the biggest disappointment that came out of this for me when I heard the sentence was running concurrent, which means at the same time as his Peruvian sentence, meaning he'll get no additional time. It's just such a disappointment,
Yeah.
But, Beth Holloway seems to be at peace with it, which I guess in the end is all that matters.
Yeah, exactly. That's the most important piece.
She does. You see a stark difference between how Beth feels about it and how Stephanie's father feels about it. Did you feel that when you were making the film?
Yeah. Well, I think he can take some satisfaction in the fact that he's serving time for Stephanie's murder.
Yeah.
One thing that was interesting that he told us was that he's taken measures to protect Joran in prison because he doesn't want him to be prematurely killed, because he wants
That gave me chills.
Yeah, he wants him to serve the sentence and like suffer.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. So, and he's very well connected there. He actually ran for, I think, some citywide office in Lima. He's kind of a famous race car driver in Peru. And then he ran this, or he still does run this company that like puts on circuses all over Peru. So
oh, wow.
He's pretty well connected politically and, I think with the police. And so he's been able to protect Joran. Although there was a story that came out within the last month that Joran got beat up pretty bad.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you know anything about the circumstances around that?
I don't, but there was also a story about that right before he came to Alabama last year. So, I don't think he's got a lot of friends in prison down there.
As he shouldn't.
I can't imagine he would be really great at making friends. I think he's good at manipulating people, but I think he's among his own kind there who know what he's doing and know what he's all about.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. He's good at making girlfriends, though.
Yeah.
He's very good at that. Can we talk about that a little bit? Because that was a big part of your film that I did not realize. One, that he was married. He got married while in prison. He was able to have a daughter, which that's chilling.
Yeah.
And then also was able to make a girlfriend while he's still married, and he sets her up. So do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's just wild that he, because they're allowed visitors in jail, some of his cellmates, would start bringing in like friends of their girlfriends for him in exchange, I'm sure, for him doing something for them, whether it be supplying them with drugs or money or whatever. But so he starts meeting these girls who come in. One of them, he ends up marrying. And, as you mentioned, he has a daughter with who I'm trying to think how old she is. She's probably about 9 now, I think.
Yeah.
And she's constantly bringing him things, so he's getting a lot out of not only the woman he married, but every girlfriend since. Where, they're constantly bringing stuff in for him. And, but yeah, he's very charming. And, we interviewed the the current girlfriend, although there's also been a story that's come out recently that he's got 3 women now visiting him. She's one of them, but two others. I don't know that the divorce is final, but I think it's in process. So yeah, and he's just they love him. Like, as you see from the girlfriend we interviewed, he gave her a trinket that she showed us. She also brought a painting to the interview that he had done. He sends her all these letters with hearts and stars, she says. Real charmer, and just the weirdest thing is that she said, she was with him for protection, but how is a guy who's behind bars going to protect you from anything?
Yeah.
That was rather confusing. And as angry as it seemed like she was at him, because it did seem like she was upset about obviously what ultimately ended up happening, where he set her up to bring drugs into the prison, it did still seem like she cared for him in showing the trinket and the keychain.
Yeah.
And that was interesting.
Yeah. Well, what was interesting is that, she basically said she still loved him, but that she regretted ever meeting him. And it seemed to us when we did the interview that it was over between them. But at that point, he was in the States, so she may have thought she'd never see him again. And then as soon as he got sent back to Peru late last year, there was a story in the Peruvian press that she was again visiting him in prison. And now 2 other women are visiting him as well. So I don't know how she feels about that. But clearly she didn't cut all ties, even though she's now a fugitive because, he had her smuggling drugs into the prison.
And she's a fugitive in Peru, right?
Yeah, she is.
So you wonder how she's even still visiting.
That's the weird thing. She didn't want to tell us where she lived. She met us at a certain place in this town, and it was all very hush hush. And she said, she's worried about, like, if she gets arrested, that what's going to happen to her kids, and she's trying to work like under the table to support them. But I didn't get the sense that they're knocking down her door. Like, I feel like the Peruvian authorities have bigger fish to fry. And
it sounds like that.
Yeah, and I feel like they've sort of just stopped trying to find her. And yeah, if she's visiting him in jail again, you have to wonder like,
how high priorities.
Yeah, how come she's not being arrested, or is she going under a different name? But
right.
I don't know. But it's just weird.
It's weird, and it's really scary ultimately how he can manipulate people, and the fact that he's going to be like late 50s, early 60s when he gets out of prison. It's scary to think that everything that happened to Natalie, everything that happened to Stephanie could happen again.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Beth Holloway even said before anything happened to Stephanie, like, I want this guy to be arrested, apprehended, because this is going to happen again. She knew what she was talking about.
Yeah. Although you do wonder if, like, he gets to that last year or so in prison and Stephanie's father calls off the security,
That's kind of what, fingers crossed on that one.
Yeah.
Because
I could see that happening, where he
that's
just
some real
stops
dad
protecting him. So
that's what I was hoping would happen.
Yeah. Well, I guess we'll have to wait and see. But so he'll be, I think, 56 or 57 when he gets out. And somebody like him, a leopard like him, doesn't change his spots. So he's not going to come out a reformed man, an upstanding citizen.
No, you can see he's doing the same stuff in prison. Everything we were just talking about is what he would do on the streets.
Yeah.
And it's unfortunately working for him in prison as well, to a certain extent. So he's not being shown any kind of, consequences for his actions.
Yeah.
He's still luring women in. He's still getting things.
Yep.
Like, it's not on a good path so far.
I wonder if that would have differed had he served prison time in the States.
Quite possibly. It wouldn't have been, a picnic like it seems to be down there.
No, not at all. Is there anything that we haven't touched on that you wanted to touch on talking about your film?
Well, one thing that struck me is just how raw it all still is. Maybe it's partly because of the confession that just came out and the fact that everything was back in the headlines. But we interviewed, as you saw in the film, Natalie's best friend, Claire, Natalie's brother, people even, that knew Stephanie. And all these years later, it just does not get any easier. It's just clear that these folks were traumatized for life. And it's just so sad that one person could do that to so many people.
Like you said, it affects so many different people.
Yeah, it's just really, there were some hard interviews, it was just really emotional and sad. And it's too bad that these things happen. But I think it's important to tell the stories particularly to like younger women who didn't grow up with the Natalie story, that, aren't aware of it, that are going out all the time. And
absolutely,
they need to be careful, that these guys are out there.
Absolutely. It's a cautionary tale in its own right.
It really is.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, that's what I took from it. Joran is not the only Joran.
No,
so,
absolutely not.
No.
Unfortunately.
So we have to always be on our guard.
Absolutely. And last question, wrapping things up here.
Yeah.
What is the main thing that you want people to feel or reflect on after they finish the documentary?
Well, I hope it was a worthy tribute to the two girls that died and to their families and everything they've been through. And as you say, a cautionary tale that we can prevent things like this from happening in the future just by being more aware of psychopathy and psychopaths and how they operate. And so, I mean, that's kind of it. It's, it's just one of those stories that, when I first got into it, I didn't realize how many layers there were to it. But yeah, really compelling story to tell, but it takes a lot out of you. So that's part of why I don't do true crime all the time, is because, I think some folks you guys have a podcast about it, right? So you're able to kind of live with it all the time. I have
hard
a hard time
though.
with it.
It's hard. We do true crime and paranormal. And sometimes after a couple of cases like this, we have to break and go to something paranormal because it affects you a lot less.
Yeah, we'll break into like some, haunted hotel, or we'll talk about like some like weird history or something like that, just to kind of, because it like sits with you.
Yeah.
And it starts leaching into other parts of your life. And you're like, okay,
Yeah.
I got to take a minute.
Yeah.
Did you do anything after this to kind of self-care after going through all of that?
I jumped right onto another project, actually sort of simultaneous to this, which is not true crime, but it's about survivors of Hurricane Ian in Florida.
Oh, wow.
Interesting.
Well, not everyone survives. So there's some tragedy to it, but there's also some hope and some strength and, really good people that, I got to meet and interview. So that was in some ways therapeutic, I guess.
I could definitely see that. When's that going to be coming out?
Yeah. It's interesting. I'm not sure. It was supposed to be on this month, but now it's actually been so well received internally that they may hold it back and do a series and make this the first episode of a series, in which case it may not air till next year. So
that's great.
That's awesome, though. Congratulations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great.
So I'm not sure about it yet, but yeah, it really turned out well. And it was a good way to step away from the dark world of Joran van der Sloot. It's something that, in some ways is equally dark, but
in a different way.
Right. But it was caused by Mother Nature, not by a psychopath. So.
Yeah.
A little bit different there.
Feel.
Yeah. Yeah. So, but yeah, this has been a fun conversation. So thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
And for highlighting the film, and hope everybody gets to see it on Peacock.
Absolutely.
100%. And like you said, you wanted it to be a tribute to the families. I think you did a great job. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
I think it was awesome.
Good,
and I think you did a really good job showing both stories like you said you wanted to. So hats off to you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks. And it was great to have their participation, you know, and their kind of blessing. So that meant a lot.
Definitely. I can only imagine.
Yeah.
So
thank you so much for talking with us.
Yeah, thank you so much.
This was really great.
Welcome.
And everybody go check out Pathological, The Lies of Joran van der Sloot. You are in for a wild ride if you haven't seen it.
Do it.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks.
Thanks
I
again.
Appreciate it. It's fun.
Thank you. Guys, that was amazing.
That went so well. I always get so nervous before interviews.
No, I do too.
Especially like you and I will usually switch off like who's going to take lead on it. And when it's one of our turn to take lead, where the other one is like, you got this. You're like Barbara Walters.
You're Barbara Walters.
I like to now think of myself as Alex Cooper.
I like that.
Yeah.
Oh, there you go.
She's
become the gold standard.
She's this generation's Babs.
Yeah, I'm into it.
Yeah, I
Alex
love
Cooper
it.
forever.
Shout out to her.
You were amazing.
Thank you.
You did really well. I just got to give it to you.
Thanks.
You were just, Ash can think on her feet when it comes to interview questions.
I had to.
Hats off.
I had written down some questions in prep, like a lot, and then we just ended up going through a lot of them.
Right through those.
And I was like, fuck, I have a lot more to come up with on the fly, but it worked out. And he was so great. at giving us a lot of information and a lot to like continue to build upon.
That's the thing. When you have a good guest, it's like, it's so easy to, because then you have more questions organically.
Yeah.
You're just like, wait a second, you're interesting. I want to ask you more.
Exactly. So thank you, Chris.
Yeah, thank you to Chris Cassel, because you ruled.
You ruled. And everybody go check out Peacock's Pathological, The Lies of Joran van der Sloot.
Do it.
And we hope you keep listening.
And we hope you
keep
it
weird. But not so weird that you don't go check out that documentary, because you'd be a silly fool if you didn't.
Don't have silly goose behavior and not do that.
Come on.